Hey guys, tonight we are wandering into one of those corners of history that makes you wonder how people manage to balance everyday life with some pretty unusual traditions. Imagine this. The Mesopotamian night air feels heavy and warm. The smell of baked clay walls mixes with the faint smoke of oil lamps, and you're standing at the base of a massive ziggurat, its steps rising like a stairway to the stars. From a distance, the temple's walls gleam faintly, almost like the building itself is awake. You're probably thinking you could climb up there, but let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive more than a few minutes of the guard's suspicious stares or the climb itself if you forgot to bring water. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and the time where you're tuning in. I'm curious, are you lying in bed at midnight in New York? Or sneaking a quick history lesson at noon in Mumbai? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you move closer to the temple, you start to realize this isn't just an ordinary building. This is a place where heaven and earth are meant to touch. Every brick whispers with prayers that have been repeated for centuries. Mesopotamians believed their gods needed constant attention, fed with offerings, soothed with music, and yes, entertained in ways that might make your modern eyebrows rise. The people here saw life as a fragile contract with forces they could never fully control. Flood from the Tigris and Euphrates, scorching heat that could burn crops, or winds that could scatter harvests. So the temple wasn't just a holy site. It was the community's insurance policy. And within that policy lived a role that still makes historians tilt their heads and argue. The temple prostitute. You can almost see the figures moving quietly within the shadow of the walls. Women, and sometimes men, whose bodies were believed to bridge human and divine. Were they simply hired companions? Or were they performing acts meant to please the gods themselves? That's where the debate begins. You picture the scene. Oil lamps flickering, shadows dancing across carved walls. The faint clink of bronze jewelry as someone steps softly across polished tiles. These women weren't just wandering the streets. They belonged to the temple economy. Some carried titles linked directly to goddesses like Inanna or Ishtar, whose myths were filled with passion, love, and the chaos of desire. To serve her meant embodying the goddess herself, if only for a fleeting moment. But don't mistake this for a life of simple luxury. For every whispered tale of beauty and reverence, there were probably twice as many of hardship, jealousy, and even scandal. Historians still argue whether temple prostitution was widespread and organized, or whether later writers, especially outsiders, blew a few isolated rituals into something more sensational. Kind of like how you remember one weird uncle at a wedding, and suddenly the whole event feels like chaos. And here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have dug up records that mention Nadatu women, who technically weren't prostitutes at all. They were dedicated to the temple, lived in cloister-like quarters, and often came from wealthy families. Many weren't allowed to marry or have children, but they could own property, lend money, and basically run their own mini banks. So while one set of temple women may have been linked to sacred intimacy, another group held financial power. You see how messy this gets? The term temple prostitute covers a wide range of roles, and historians are still untangling the knot. As you picture the city around you, the layers of daily life start to come alive. Farmers unloading baskets of barley at the gates, merchants haggling over copper, kids chasing each other through narrow alleys, all of them looking up at the same ziggurat, knowing that inside, mysterious rituals are taking place. You're caught between curiosity and caution. Part of you wants to sneak inside and see what's really happening. part of you knows you'd probably trip on the stairs and cause a scene, forever remembered as that outsider who fell during sacred ceremony night. Not the legacy you want. Still, the glow of the temple pulls you closer. The Mesopotamians believed that their gods weren't abstract beings tucked away in the clouds. They walked among humans. They could be appeased, and they could be angered. So when women stepped into the role of sacred partners, they weren't just offering comfort to priests or kings. They were symbolically giving the gods what humans hope to receive in return: fertility, prosperity, and protection. You pause to think about how bold this concept is. Imagine your community deciding that someone's job is to stand in for a goddess, to take on her qualities in both ritual and intimacy. It's a reminder that ancient cultures had a different rhythm, one where the sacred and the sensual weren't necessarily kept in separate boxes. And so, as you linger beneath the temple walls, the night stretching wide above you, you realize you're about to walk into a world where devotion and desire blur together, where myths shape human roles, and where history still leaves us with more questions than answers. You step a little closer now, squinting at the temple's broad staircase, and it hits you that this place isn't just about bricks and incense. It's about people believing they can coax the gods into listening. And in Mesopotamia, coaxing the gods was a full-time job. You can hear the chants wafting from inside, the kind that start low and then climb into something almost hypnotic. The air itself feels charged, like static before a storm. You get the sense that you're standing near the center of a cosmic negotiation. Inside, the temple is more than a building. It's the house of a god. Literally, priests cared for the deity's statue like it was alive, feeding it, bathing it, even tucking it in at night. You'd probably chuckle at the thought of a divine bedtime routine, but to the Mesopotamians, the god was really there, embodied in that statue. And if the god needed food, music, or comfort, then the humans had better deliver. This is where the temple prostitutes, or sacred companions, depending on which scholar you ask, come into play. Their role wasn't random indulgence. It was woven into a fabric of ritual acts designed to maintain cosmic balance. Think of it less like a wild party and more like a carefully choreographed performance, where every gesture symbolized something bigger. The heart of it was fertility. The land needed water, crops needed to grow, herds needed to multiply, families needed heirs. If any of these links broke, society faltered. So intimacy wasn't just private. It was public, symbolic, even political. By embodying the goddess Inanna or Ishtar, these women turned human desire into a sacred offering. The ritual intimacy was thought to fertilize not only the body, but also the soil, the city, the kingdom itself. Imagine planting seeds while also staging a play for the gods, and you're getting close to the vibe. Historians still argue whether every temple had such rituals or if only select cults practiced them. Some suggest the sacred marriage rite, where a high priestess or temple woman joined with the king, happened only once a year. Others think there were ongoing roles for women who served in less formal but still spiritual ways. The frustrating truth? The cuneiform tablets are dusty, broken, and written by people who assumed you already knew the context, like finding your grandma's grocery list and trying to reconstruct her entire diet. Here's a fun tidbit that breaks up the heaviness. Some Mesopotamian texts describe the goddess Inanna herself sneaking off for romantic escapades, often with her beloved Dumuzi, the shepherd god. These stories were so central that priests and priestesses might reenact them in ritual dramas. Picture it, the temple courtyard echoing with poetry, drums, and song as humans pretended to be divine lovers. It sounds almost like dinner theater, except the audience believed the universe's survival was at stake. Now, step into that chamber again with me. Oil lamps cast a soft glow on painted walls. The air smells of cedar and myrrh. You notice women wearing linen robes, jewelry tinkling softly as they move. Each gesture is rehearsed, pouring wine, singing hymns, preparing their bodies as if preparing an altar. You think it feels theatrical, but it was also sincere. The Mesopotamians weren't winking at each other saying, "Well, here's the fun part." They believed these acts maintained the delicate bridge between gods and mortals. And yet, the ambiguity lingers. Were these women willing participants, honored for their sacred role? Or were some pressed into service, their lives decided by family or temple contracts? Scholars can't fully agree. Some argue the role gave women unusual independence and status, access to wealth, influence, and property. Others suggest the opposite, that it was restrictive, binding them to roles they couldn't escape. It's the historical equivalent of debating whether being a famous movie star is empowering or just a gilded cage. Both can be true, depending on who you ask. Meanwhile, outside these chambers, the ordinary citizens probably had mixed feelings. For some, the rituals must have been awe-inspiring, a reminder that their gods were cared for properly. For others, maybe it stirred gossip or unease. It's easy to imagine a farmer muttering, "So the king gets to be with the priestess for the harvest festival, but my barley still died?" Sounds rigged. As you let your eyes drift across the temple's vast courtyard, you realize the role of sacred companions was less about individual pleasure and more about communal survival. The gods were moody, unpredictable, and often destructive. Anything that promised to win their favor was embraced, even if it blurred the line between holy and human. And for the people of Mesopotamia, that line was never as sharp as it is for you now. You ease deeper into the temple grounds, and just as you're starting to piece together the rhythms of these rituals, a familiar name drifts across time: Herodotus. Yes, that chatty Greek traveler who couldn't resist writing down every rumor, no matter how outrageous. His account of Mesopotamian temple prostitution is one of those stories that makes historians squint and mutter. Really, Herodotus? Again, according to him, every woman in Babylon had to present herself at the temple of Ishtar at least once in her life, waiting for a stranger to toss a coin in her lap. After performing her duty, she went home, absolved of obligation. Now, on the surface, that sounds shocking. An entire city's women queuing like pilgrims at a shrine. You can almost picture the crowd control. Priests with clipboards, someone shouting next, over the din, and bewildered women rolling their eyes. But here's the thing. Most modern scholars think Herodotus either misunderstood, exaggerated, or was fed a story by locals who enjoyed messing with foreign journalists. It wouldn't be the first time. The Greeks had a habit of framing foreign customs in ways that made them sound exotic, scandalous, or just plain strange. And the Babylonian temple was the perfect setting for such tales. Grand architecture, mysterious rituals, and a goddess associated with love and war. Add a foreigner with a notebook, and you've got yourself an ancient tabloid scoop. Still, his story stuck. Later writers repeated it, often without question, until it became the default narrative. Oh yes, in Babylon, every woman was a temple prostitute. Historians still argue whether there's any kernel of truth. Maybe certain festivals involve temporary ritual unions. Maybe only specific women of the temple participated. But the blanket claim doesn't hold water. Archaeology hasn't produced a single smoking gun tablet saying, mandatory temple shifts, all women must serve. Instead, we see fragments about priestesses, Natata women, and cult singers, each with specific duties. It's like finding out the rumor about everyone in your high school joining the marching band is, in fact, nonsense. Here's a quirky tidbit. The word Herodotus used might not have meant prostitute in the sense we imagine. Some translations suggest it referred to set-apart women, which could describe priestesses, musicians, or even caretakers of the goddess's image. Imagine mistranslating choir singer into nightclub dancer, a world of difference, and yet the story spirals out of control. You can almost see Herodotus wandering through Babylon's bustling streets, wide-eyed at the towering ziggurat, scribbling furiously while locals leaned over and whispered, "Tell him the one about every woman in the city waiting for a stranger." A perfect prank. He'd write it down, take it back to Greece, and bam, the world's most famous game of telephone. But don't dismiss the whole idea too quickly. While the mandatory participation tale is likely exaggerated, the concept of sacred union wasn't fiction. There really were rituals, especially around the new year, where a king symbolically joined with a priestess representing Inanna or Ishtar. This hieros gamos, or sacred marriage, was a performance to ensure fertility and cosmic order. Some scholars think Herodotus took a fragment of this tradition and ballooned it into a city-wide spectacle. And yet, the debate rages. Was he intentionally sensational or simply naive? Did Babylonians truly have customs that outsiders found shocking, or were they being caricatured through foreign eyes? Historians still argue whether his account reflects a garbled version of reality or a complete fabrication. Either way, you can thank him for centuries of eyebrow-raising myths. Meanwhile, imagine yourself back in that temple courtyard, watching priests recite hymns while worshippers bring offerings. Instead of lines of women waiting for coins, you see families clutching baskets of grain, traders unloading jars of honey, and singers lifting their voices toward the goddess's shrine. The mood feels reverent, not transactional. If anything, you start to realize how powerful storytelling is. One outsider's claim can overshadow centuries of lived experience. And yet, there's a strange irony here. Even if Herodotus exaggerated, his tale captured something true about how the ancient world linked sex, ritual, and divinity. The details may be wrong, but the broader theme, that intimacy could be sacred, public, and cosmic, remains real. It's a reminder that history isn't always about accuracy. Sometimes it's about the stories people choose to believe. You glance up at the temple walls again, wondering how many layers of rumor and reality are hidden in those bricks. If you ask the priests themselves, they might smile faintly, offer you some watered beer, and say, "Ah, foreigners always misunderstand. Sit down, listen to the hymns, and stop worrying about what your neighbor's daughter is doing." You keep wandering through the temple grounds, and now your attention drifts toward the goddess herself, the heart of this entire system. Inanna, or Ishtar as the Babylonians called her, wasn't some meek figure sitting quietly on a cloud. She was bold, unpredictable, and dazzling, the goddess of love, war, and all the passions that make humans do questionable things. If you try to fit her into a modern category, she'd be part rock star, part general, part romance novelist, and part unpredictable weather pattern. People adored her, feared her, and depended on her all at once. Her myths were anything but shy. One day, she's storming the gates of the underworld, demanding a crown from her sister Ereshkigal. The next, she's swooning over Dumuzi, the shepherd god, in passionate poems that read almost like love songs. And tucked into these stories is the recurring theme of desire. Not hidden, not whispered about in embarrassment, but celebrated as divine power. To serve Inanna meant stepping into this whirlwind of beauty, chaos, and fertility. That's where the temple women came in. You picture them not as nameless figures, but as living embodiments of Inanna. Their clothing might shimmer with beads and bright fabrics. echoing the goddess's mythical adornments. They might sing hymns that retold her adventures, their voices weaving myth into ritual. When they stepped into intimate rites, it wasn't just about human touch. It was about channeling Inanna's cosmic energy into the world. You could almost imagine the goddess herself watching from the shadows, nodding in approval or frowning because she was famously moody. Historians still argue whether these women had permanent roles or were chosen temporarily for festivals. Some suggest that priestesses of Inanna were high status, respected, and even feared because who wouldn't be nervous around someone thought to embody a goddess of love and war? Others argue their lives were more restricted, bound by temple rules and economic obligations. The truth, as usual, probably lived somewhere between reverence and control. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Sumerian hymns describe Inanna's temples as buzzing with activity. Musicians, dancers, even tavern keepers. These weren't quiet cloisters. They were cultural hubs. Imagine a space that felt part cathedral, part theater, part bustling marketplace. The women of Inanna weren't isolated. They were right in the middle of it all, their presence both sacred and social. You can almost smell the incense drifting through those halls, hear the tambourines shaking in rhythm, feel the floor vibrate with chanting. The atmosphere wasn't designed to hush you into solemn silence, but to pull you into sensory overload. And somewhere in the middle of it, the temple women moved gracefully, embodying Inanna's dual nature, offering tenderness in one moment and fierce defiance in the next. The goddess herself wasn't exactly the model of stability. She could bless fields with fertility and then, in the same myth, unleash destruction on a whim. Worshippers lived in awe of this unpredictability, and perhaps the temple women reflected it. They were admired for their sacred roles, but also whispered about, maybe even feared, because their work touched the rawest parts of human experience: love, desire, vulnerability. Think about how bold this must have felt in a world where survival depended on crops, herds, and children. To link all of that to a goddess who reveled in passion was both risky and reassuring. Risky because Inanna could turn on you. Reassuring because if you pleased her, the rewards might flow through every aspect of life. And so, as you watch the temple women prepare their offerings, perfumed oils, sweet dates, polished mirrors, you see more than individuals. You see stand-ins for a goddess whose presence loomed over the entire city. Each ritual touch, each whispered hymn, was a thread connecting mortals to the divine tapestry. The irony? While modern ears might focus on the intimacy, the Mesopotamians probably saw it as just one piece of a much larger ritual picture. They didn't compartmentalize love, fertility, and worship the way we do. For them, these elements were braided together, like reeds woven into a single strong basket. If you try to separate them, the whole thing might collapse. So, standing in the glow of Inanna's temple, you realize this wasn't a world of tidy categories. Here, gods could be passionate, worship could be sensual, and women could be divine vessels. It's a world that refuses to fit neatly into your expectations, and maybe that's why it still fascinates us thousands of years later. You linger now near the edge of the courtyard, where shadows stretch long against baked brick walls, and you start to notice something subtle. The way people glance toward the temple, and the way they whisper when the subject of its women comes up. Inside those walls, the goddess's rituals unfold with careful reverence. But outside, the city hums with rumor, awe, and a touch of judgment. That tension between sacred honor and street corner gossip is the thread that weaves rulers, priests, and ordinary citizens together in their relationship with these temple figures. For the kings of Mesopotamia, the presence of sacred women wasn't just religious, it was political theater. Imagine the royal court preparing for the New Year festival, when the king himself might perform the sacred marriage ritual with a high priestess. To the crowd, this union wasn't about two humans. It was about the king embodying Dumuzi and the priestess embodying Inanna. Their symbolic intimacy promised fertility for the land, prosperity for the kingdom, and legitimacy for the ruler. If you think modern politicians stage photo ops, just picture one of them reenacting a divine honeymoon in front of half the city. Talk about pressure. Priests, meanwhile, were the managers of this delicate balance. They had to supervise the temple women, maintain the rituals, and make sure everything looked polished for both gods and people. And yes, historians still argue whether these priests were stern bureaucrats, protective caretakers, or opportunistic middlemen. It's entirely possible they were all three, depending on the day and the size of the temple budget. You can almost hear one muttering, "The incense costs how much this year?" while juggling clay tablets full of expenses. Ordinary citizens, though, probably saw things differently. For them, the temple women were both awe-inspiring and distant. A farmer might pray to Inanna for his fields, grateful for the priestess who embodied her in ritual. Yet in the same breath, he might grumble about the taxes that funded temple ceremonies. A mother might bring her daughter to watch the festival, both fascinated and wary of the women moving gracefully through the crowd. And then there were the whispers, tales traded in taverns about what really went on behind those walls. Some stories probably veered into scandal, the way gossip always does when mystery lingers. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Mesopotamian records suggest that certain temple women held privileges ordinary women could only dream of. They might own property, run businesses, or act as witnesses in contracts. This made them figures of both respect and envy. Imagine walking past a woman in fine linen, her status tied not to a husband but to a goddess, and trying not to mutter, "Well, must be nice." Social tension was inevitable, and yet respect clung to them. Even if ordinary people whispered or rolled their eyes, the sacred connection mattered. A city that neglected its goddess was a city inviting disaster. So these women carried symbolic weight for everyone. That made the line between admiration and suspicion razor thin. Too much power, and they were envied. Too much intimacy, and they were judged. It's the same paradox celebrities face today. Admired on stage, gossiped about off it. Historians still argue whether the temple women felt empowered by their roles or trapped within them. Were they celebrated as earthly reflections of Inanna, or were they tightly controlled by priests and politics? The truth is probably messy, shifting depending on the temple, the dynasty, and the individual woman. In one city, she might have walked with dignity and authority. In another, she might have lived in quiet restraint. As you stand in that Mesopotamian street, you can almost hear both sides. The priest praising the sacred union for securing the harvest, and the merchant muttering that his barley shipment still spoiled despite the festival. The temple women occupied a space both central and contested, revered, envied, and talked about in equal measure. And so, the glow of the temple is never just about divine ritual. It's also about human politics, social tension, and the timeless habit of people to gossip about those whose lives seem different from their own. You slip inside one of the inner chambers now, away from the noise of the courtyard, and suddenly the atmosphere changes. The sounds of the city fade into a hush, broken only by the soft flicker of oil lamps and the faint rustle of linen. Here, the women prepare themselves not just as participants in ritual, but as vessels of the goddess, and the details, small, sensory, human, become as important as the grand myths outside. On a low table, bronze mirrors gleam. Not the glassy kind you're used to, but polished metal that reflects a face in warm, hazy tones. A woman leans over one, tilting her head, adjusting the beads in her hair. Nearby, another dips her fingers into a jar of scented oil, cedar, myrrh, maybe even imported frankincense if the temple was wealthy. The air fills with a fragrance that feels both luxurious and overwhelming, as if even your lungs are reminded that this is no ordinary night. You notice the fabrics, too. Fine linen robes that whisper as they move, dyed bands of red or blue to echo Inanna's adornments. Bronze bangles clink softly on wrists. It's not just ornamentation, it's transformation. Each detail builds the illusion that the goddess herself has stepped into the room. You might joke that it feels like history's earliest makeover montage, but here, the stakes are divine. And yet, these preparations weren't only about beauty. They were ritual acts in themselves. Washing, anointing, and dressing were ways of purifying the body, of turning flesh into an altar. Just as priests bathed the statue of the god, the women bathed themselves, becoming vessels fit for sacred work. You get the sense that every drop of oil, every brush of kohl around the eyes, was a prayer disguised as cosmetics. Historians still argue about the exact nature of these rituals. Some suggest the women performed sacred music and danced more often than intimacy itself, turning the chambers into theaters of sound and movement. Others believe the sensual aspect was real but rare, reserved for special festivals. The lack of clear records leaves us peering through a fog of speculation, trying to decide whether the chamber felt more like a spa, a stage, or a sanctum. Here's a quirky tidbit. Mesopotamian texts describe perfumes with surprising specificity. Recipes survive for oils mixed with cedarwood, cypress, and juniper, sometimes boiled together in clay pots. One record even lists the scent that makes the god rejoice. Imagine scribbling that onto your shopping list. Milk, bread, incense, divine-pleasing perfume. It's proof that smell was central to worship, a way to invite the gods through the nose as well as the heart. The women themselves might have felt the weight of performance. Outside these walls, people whispered. Inside, every gesture had to shimmer with meaning. Pouring wine into a cup wasn't just hospitality. It was reenacting the goddess offering abundance. Sitting beside a guest wasn't casual companionship. It was Inanna blessing the union between human and divine. You can almost see the dual consciousness in their eyes. Half themselves, half goddess. And yet, beneath all the ritual polish, they were still human. Maybe one worried about a sick relative, or thought the new shipment of frankincense smelled too sharp. Maybe another sighed as she adjusted her jewelry for the 100th time. That tension between divinity and humanity was always present. And perhaps that's what made the rituals powerful. They weren't performed by perfect beings, but by ordinary people carrying extraordinary symbolism. As you take in the chamber, with its flickering shadows, its scented air, its quiet intensity, you realize the preparations were as important as the ritual itself. To embody a goddess required transformation, not just in action, but in presence. And for the Mesopotamians, that transformation was proof that the gods really did touch the world through human hands. You're standing at the edge of a Mesopotamian city in the early morning, watching the first glow of sunrise touch the ziggurats' stepped sides, and your attention shifts to the line of women moving toward the temple courtyards. Some carry baskets of bread, others jugs of beer, and a few wear jewelry that gleams even in the dusty air. These are not merchants' wives or simple villagers. These are women known for their sacred duties, sometimes called temple prostitutes, though the modern phrase feels clunky and doesn't quite capture the layered role they play. You watch them walk in quiet procession, their anklets jingling softly, and you realize this is no casual job. It's part of a city's spiritual machinery. In Mesopotamia, temples were not just holy sites. They were the beating hearts of the economy. Grain was stored there, contracts were sealed there, and festivals poured wealth into them like today's stadiums during a championship game. So it's no surprise that women serving in the temple had both religious and economic significance. You see, they weren't tucked away in some shadowy corner. They were visible, woven into the daily rhythms of trade and devotion. Farmers might drop off their barley, then slip a coin toward a priestess as a symbolic offering. Whether that offering went into her hand or the temple treasury, well, that's where historians still argue whether these women were independent earners or strictly managed by the priesthood. Imagine yourself as a merchant. You haul sacks of sesame and copper ingots to the temple courtyard. After the priest tallies your goods, you might find yourself invited to stay for a ritual feast. A woman approaches, not with a crude transaction, but with incense and song. Her presence reminds you that wealth isn't only measured in grain and silver, but in fertility, prosperity, and favor from the gods. The act itself, physical or symbolic, folds into the larger idea of keeping the cosmos balanced. If you profit later in the season, you chalk it up not to luck, but to the gods' blessing mediated through that encounter. Here's the quirky bit. Clay tablets sometimes list temple workers alongside donkeys and plowmen, which feels a bit demeaning until you realize it was simply bookkeeping. The temple scribes had a knack for reducing sacred acts into grain measures and silver weights, like some ancient accountants stripping romance out of everything. You'd think a divine ritual might get a more poetic entry, but nope. 2 measures of barley, 1 priestess, 1 evening. Try fitting that into your modern tax forms. It wasn't all about solemn duty, though. These women also shaped the social fabric. In some accounts, they were teachers of music, keepers of dance, and even arbiters of fashion. Picture a teenager in 2000 BCE copying the hairstyle of a temple priestess the same way kids today copy a pop star's haircut. Temples weren't just places of sacrifice. They were cultural stages. Now, zoom out and look at the temple's role as an economic hub. Silver from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and timber from Lebanon all passed through these gates. Ritual specialists, including the temple prostitutes, were woven into this trade web, ensuring that prosperity was linked directly with the divine. Some scholars even speculate that offering intimacy in this sacred context symbolically tied the fertility of the land to the fertility of human relationships. It was like saying, if the goddess smiles on this union, maybe she'll smile on the barley harvest too. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Even in their own time, there were voices grumbling about corruption. You can almost hear an old man muttering by the city gate. Back in my day, you just sacrificed a goat. Now it's all silver coins and pretty girls with anklets. The tension between piety and commerce was alive and well, and you can't help but smile at how familiar that sounds. Like someone today complaining about ticket prices at a megachurch concert. Still, when the festival drums beat and the statues of the gods were carried through the streets, all those complaints dissolved into incense, smoke, and song. The temple prostitutes were there in the thick of it, welcoming pilgrims, soothing anxieties, and embodying the goddess's presence in ways no pile of silver could. Their role reminded people that wealth without blessing was just empty metal, and blessing without ritual felt incomplete. As night falls, you see those same women retreating behind the temple walls. Lamps flicker, casting warm shadows. The city quiets, but the temple remains alive, humming with prayer and trade, devotion and desire. You realize that in Mesopotamia, the economy and the sacred weren't separate spheres. They were one braided rope, and temple prostitutes were the strands that made the weave hold together. The temple, for all its incense and offerings, is also a marketplace. You step through a side entrance and find yourself in the hum of a courtyard where jars of grain sit neatly beside baskets of figs, and copper scales clink as merchants argue about fairness. At first, it feels odd. Shouldn't a holy place be shielded from the bustle of trade? But here in Mesopotamia, the gods are not aloof. They are landlords, grain lords, debt collectors, and sometimes generous benefactors. Temples own farmland, herds, and slaves. They run breweries and textile workshops. So, of course, the women who serve within them, yes, including the temple prostitutes, are tied up in this same web of exchange. Picture yourself leaning against a cool mud brick wall, trying to look like you belong, while around you sacred meals are prepared and contracts are written on damp clay tablets. One scribe squints and mutters about how many sheep the temple owes to another city. Another scratches symbols recording offerings from a merchant who clearly hopes the goddess will smile on his shipping expedition. The prostitutes, in this context, are more than women offering ritual companionship. They are also visible symbols of wealth and piety, proof that the temple can sustain not only priests and sacrifices, but also specialized roles that draw pilgrims and donors. Here's the mainstream fact. Temples in cities like Ur and Babylon were the biggest landholders of their time, with sprawling estates that made them economic juggernauts. These were less churches and more corporations with divine branding. And while you might expect the priesthood to keep strictly clerical duties, reality was muddier. Ritual specialists, musicians, brewers, and sex workers all slotted into the payroll, each necessary to keep the gears of worship and commerce aligned. Now, for the quirky tidbit. Did you know some temples acted almost like early banks? Wealthy people deposited silver or grain, and the temple lent it out with interest. It's as if your local savings account also smelled like burnt goat fat and echoed with hymns to Inanna. Makes you wonder whether ancient accountants had to chant before balancing the books. The temple prostitutes, then, weren't isolated from this economic machine. A wealthy merchant might sponsor their upkeep, ensuring his name remained inscribed in ledgers as a patron of the goddess. Pilgrims might offer payment for ritual union, which then rolled back into temple coffers. Some scholars even suggest that the allure of these rituals encouraged trade routes themselves. Men traveled not only for barley and tin, but for blessings wrapped in intimacy. And yet, historians still argue whether such transactions were genuinely religious, or whether the temple quietly blurred lines between sacred duty and straightforward commerce. Were these unions meant as metaphors for fertility, or were they simply lucrative services framed with divine storytelling? You wander deeper into the courtyard, and it feels like both truths could exist at once. Ritual purity on one side, hard-nosed economics on the other. Imagine the gossip swirling at the market stalls. A potter leans over his wheel and murmurs that a rival merchant spent lavishly at the temple, securing the goddess's favor before shipping his wares upriver. A weaver rolls her eyes, claiming the goddess prefers honest cloth, not bribes. You can almost hear echoes of modern-day debates. Was it faith, networking, or marketing strategy? Of course, this blending of commerce and worship wasn't accidental. It reinforced the temple's central role in daily life. By tying fertility rituals to economics, society made sure that trade, sex, harvest, and divine blessing all spoke the same language. You didn't separate body from business. You prayed with your purse open. Now, Tuck that thought in the back of your mind, like a clay receipt sealed and stored away, because the sound of footsteps in the dust is drawing you toward another chamber, one where the rituals grow stranger and the debate grows louder. You pause at the thought of how these temple roles existed alongside the rising idea of kingship, that glittering invention of Mesopotamia where one man claimed to hold heaven and earth in a kind of political handshake. You picture yourself stepping into the royal courts of Uruk, perhaps the most famous city in Sumer, where the larger-than-life figure of Gilgamesh still looms across centuries. The connection between sacred sexuality and royal legitimacy is not a casual rumor. It's practically carved into stone tablets. Kings claimed authority not only through military power, but also through something rather intimate: ritual union with a priestess of Inanna. This sacred marriage is described in hymns not as a steamy soap opera, but as a cosmic performance where the fertility of the land depended on how convincingly the two human participants reenacted divine love. You can almost hear the court musicians droning their harps, the smell of roasted lamb drifting from the kitchens, while outside the peasants squabble over irrigation ditches. Inside the palace, the king's supposed ability to bring rains and crops is symbolically tied to his performance in a bedchamber. You probably won't survive trying to explain that to your boss during a modern job review, but in Mesopotamia, that was literally part of the royal resume. Historians still argue whether this sacred marriage was performed physically each year or whether it morphed into a more symbolic rite. Some lean toward the idea that at least in early times, the king did indeed sleep with a high-ranking temple prostitute, likely a priestess known as an Intu, to reenact the marriage of Inanna and Dumuzi, the shepherd god. Others argue the physical act gave way to recitations, hymns, and symbolic offerings as the centuries wore on, sparing everyone the awkwardness of turning theology into annual performance art. What's certain is that the poetry surrounding these rituals was strikingly sensual, yet elevated. Lines describe Inanna's thighs and Dumuzi's embrace with the same reverence you might find in a hymn about rain clouds and barley harvest. Sexuality wasn't seen as something grubby, it was cosmic plumbing. Without this union, how could rivers swell, flocks reproduce, or fields bloom? In a land where one bad flood or drought spelled mass starvation, making sure the gods felt romantically invested in your community's success seemed like a practical insurance policy. You imagine scribes hunched over their clay tablets, carefully pressing stylus into wet mud, recording both military conquests and erotic hymns with the same solemnity. To them, both carried equal weight in holding the fragile order of society together. Maybe your modern Netflix dramas seem spicy, but clay tablets from 4,000 years ago beat you to the punch with verses about divine kisses. The king's union with a temple prostitute thus wasn't just private indulgence. It was a public event cloaked in ritual. Crowds might gather outside, waiting for signs, listening to ritual songs, while only a chosen few stepped into the innermost chambers. Think of it like a bizarre blend of state inauguration, New Year's festival, and cosmic matchmaking ceremony. The king's masculinity wasn't merely personal, it was the lifeline of the nation. If he stumbled, if the ritual felt weak, whispers might spread about whether the gods still favored his rule. And yet, you can sense tension too. The people pouring their sweat into muddy fields likely knew their barley yield depended more on rainfall and irrigation ditches than on the king's bedroom activities. Did some laugh under their breath at the pomp? Historians still debate how seriously common folk took these unions. Maybe some were true believers. Others rolled their eyes while still joining the festival for free beer. What adds more intrigue is how women in these rituals could sometimes hold surprising sway. The Inta priestess wasn't a lowly servant, but often a noble woman placed in the temple, her body and voice representing the goddess herself. She could elevate or embarrass a king, depending on how she performed. That subtle power dynamic hums beneath the stone-carved facade of Mesopotamian patriarchy. Imagine a ruler, armored head to toe for battle, now bowing before a woman in a sacred bed, needing her cooperation to seal his divine authority. Quirky tidbit: some later texts hint at the ritual wine drinking and songs that accompanied the sacred marriage, like a festival blending spiritual ceremony with what suspiciously resembles an after-party. Imagine priests trying to maintain solemn dignity while half the crowd is tipsy and belting out hymns slightly off-key. Even divine unions apparently suffered from human clumsiness. And in the quiet after the ritual, the king's legitimacy felt sealed, his reign blessed by the goddess, his people reassured. Crops would grow, rivers would rise, and life would stumble forward again. Whether divine forces actually responded or not, the ritual itself knit together community belief, power, and cosmic hope. So, as you wander mentally through these ancient halls, you realize temple prostitutes weren't simply lingering on the margins. They were central to political theater, their bodies enmeshed in the fragile machinery that kept kings on their thrones and people fed. It's a reminder that in Mesopotamia, power wasn't just negotiated in dusty council halls or on blood-stained battlefields, but in perfumed chambers where sacred love and statecraft intertwined. You linger in a chamber of parchment and reed pens, the air heavy with the dry scent of ink and old clay tablets. The voices you hear are no longer those of Mesopotamian priests or temple singers, but of foreigners, merchants, soldiers, and storytellers, who passed through the gates of Babylon, Uruk, and Nineveh, and then carried their tales back across deserts and seas. Among the most famous is Herodotus, the Greek often called the father of history, though here his words seem tinged with the wide-eyed awe and scandal of a tourist more than the careful precision of a chronicler. He tells of a law in Babylon requiring every woman, once in her life, to sit within the precincts of the goddess and to give herself to a stranger in exchange for a coin, the act sanctified by the deity. You hear the murmurs of listeners back in Greece, shocked, titillated, and eager to repeat the story, as though Babylon were a place of exotic excess, where piety and desire mixed without shame. Yet as you move among the shadows of this imagined library, you also hear the quiet objections of scholars, ancient and modern, who caution that Herodotus was perhaps reporting hearsay or coloring the truth with his own fascination. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia themselves, when they can be read, speak more cautiously, describing temple staff, rituals, and priestesses, but rarely confirming such sweeping claims. Still, the echo of his tale lingered, shaping the way later civilizations thought of Babylon, a city of both grandeur and decadence. You can almost see Roman poets smirking as they copied the story centuries later, turning it into proof of Eastern excess. Travelers from neighboring lands added their own observations. Some were merchants, quick to notice how silver, grain, and livestock mingled with ritual duties, weaving economic exchange into the language of piety. Others were scribes serving foreign kings, who cataloged Mesopotamian practices in order to contrast them with their own customs. To them, the temple courtyards seemed both strange and dangerous, a place where sacred boundaries blurred and where the lines between honor and scandal dissolved like dust and rain. You imagine one such traveler sitting at a banquet in Babylon, perhaps an envoy from a smaller city-state along the Levantine coast. He watches dancers move to the beat of frame drums, hears laughter spilling across the courtyard, and wonders aloud whether the women in attendance are entertainers, priestesses, or something in between. His notes, later copied for his king, exaggerate the scene, layering rumor upon rumor until the truth is barely visible beneath the varnish of storytelling. In this way, the image of temple prostitution grew in the imagination of outsiders, not simply as fact, but as symbol, shorthand for a city that seemed to live without restraint. As you drift deeper into this section, you sense how fragile truth can be when filtered through foreign eyes. The whispers of scandal gave Mesopotamian practices an aura of notoriety, one that has never entirely faded. Even today, historians debate where reality ends and myth begins, struggling to disentangle lived ritual from exaggerated gossip. You pause, realizing that this very tension, the push and pull between reverence and rumor, sacred duty and foreign scandal, was as much a part of the story as the rituals themselves. The room of scribes fades behind you, leaving only the echo of reed pens scratching clay and the hum of voices half admiring, half condemning. You realize that temple prostitution, whatever its precise form, existed not only in ritual, but also in the imagination of those who observed it, exaggerated it, and carried its image far beyond the Euphrates. You notice how practices that once seemed timeless begin to shift, like sands rearranged by desert winds. In early Babylon, sacred sexuality holds a prominent, almost unquestioned place. Yet by the time the Assyrians rise in power, the climate feels different, heavier with rules and stricter hierarchies. You picture Babylonian priestesses of Inanna tending to altars, confident in their connection to the goddess, while in Assyria, the figure of the king dominates, overshadowing rituals that once centered on women's roles. You sense that the Assyrians, fierce in war and bureaucracy, begin to frame sexuality not only as devotion, but also as control. In their palace reliefs, you see less of the goddess's open embrace and more of kings seated rigidly, keeping order as if even love itself must bow before their authority. As dynasties shift, the sacred prostitute's place in society becomes less stable, more debated. Some temples preserve the practice as symbolic, offering carefully staged rites tied to festivals of fertility and harvest. Others quietly diminish it, replacing physical unions with songs, prayers, or the recitation of myths. You imagine a Babylonian elder telling stories of how, in his youth, entire communities gathered to celebrate the goddess through ritual lovemaking, while a younger Assyrian scribe listened skeptically, insisting that such customs no longer befit their empire's discipline. You sense the generational rift, the fading of an older worldview. Foreign conquests add further complexity. When Persian rule spreads, temple rites undergo new scrutiny. Zoroastrian ideals, suspicious of ritual sexuality, bring pressure to reshape or erase what earlier Mesopotamians embraced. You can almost feel the clash between old clay tablets recording ancient hymns to Inanna's lovers and new voices calling them corrupt or primitive. The temple women, once regarded as sacred bridges to the divine, now risk being remembered as scandalous figures in the narratives written by later conquerors. The winds of change do not blow evenly. In certain corners of Mesopotamia, smaller towns cling to old ways, their shrines still guarded by women whose roles echo the ancient union of human and divine. But in the great capitals, where politics grows more intricate and foreign eyes more watchful, sacred prostitution recedes into whispers, half forbidden, half forgotten. You feel the sorrow of a ritual losing its place, not because its meaning has vanished for the people, but because power and empire no longer allow it to stand unchallenged. And yet, despite suppression, echoes survive. In stories told by travelers, in fragments of hymns inscribed on worn clay, in the memories of those who once bowed before temple courtyards filled with music and incense, the presence of these sacred figures remains. You realize that change, while eroding public practice, does not erase memory. It only shifts it into new forms, waiting for later generations to rediscover. You begin to notice how what could not be openly practiced any longer still left its imprint, pressed into clay tablets and carved into stone reliefs. Mesopotamia, after all, was a land of scribes, and its people left behind countless records, administrative tallies, hymns, myths, and prayers. When you trace the wedge-shaped signs of cuneiform with your imagination, you see not just words, but echoes of lives once lived, rituals once performed. On a tablet you imagine held in your hands, you might find a hymn to Inanna, celebrating her union with Dumuzi, describing love in tones both sacred and erotic. These hymns, though recorded as literature, carried the memory of temple practices without naming them directly. The clay carries more than hymns. It preserves contracts and receipts from temples that list offerings brought for festivals. Jars of honey, baskets of dates, flasks of wine, perhaps even tokens of silver exchanged for rituals. The language is dry, bureaucratic, yet between the lines, you sense the unseen participants. The priest is preparing her garments, the devotee seeking the goddess's favor. The stones, too, whisper their part. Seals pressed in a clay depict couples in embrace, surrounded by divine symbols like stars, crescents, and serpents. Though small, these seals capture entire stories in miniature, condensing devotion, desire, and divine blessing into images carried on the necks or in the satchels of the faithful. You notice that art, too, records what official inscriptions avoid. On walls of ancient temples, there appear motifs of fertility. The palm tree heavy with dates, the overflowing vase of water, the pair of intertwined animals. Each symbol encodes meaning, subtle but undeniable, a language of abundance and union that ordinary people could read without words. Even in the reigns where ritual sexuality was frowned upon, these symbols persisted, woven into architecture, pottery, and jewelry. It is as if the land itself resisted forgetting, embedding memory into the very things people used every day. In museum cases of your mind's eye, you see statuettes of goddesses, their forms exaggerated in hips and breasts, unmistakably tied to themes of fertility and sexual power. Some of these figures once stood in private homes, offerings of protection or prayer, carried not by scholars, but by farmers, merchants, mothers, and daughters. When placed on shelves or in hearth niches, they linked the ordinary household to the eternal cycles of fertility and love. Even if temple rites faded, the figures remained, stubborn guardians of memory. You also imagine songs, carved into clay, yet meant to be sung aloud. The words evoke longing, devotion, and ecstasy. Voices lifted in praise of a goddess who blesses both womb and field, both human love and divine mystery. The clay preserves their outlines, but the music itself is lost. You can almost hear it faintly, a distant melody carried by desert winds, reminding you that no empire, no decree could silence the human impulse to honor life's most intimate mysteries. Thus, the symbols endure, scattered across ruins and buried in soil, surviving conquests and erasures. They do not speak openly, yet they murmur insistently, telling you that what is sacred cannot be wholly erased. It simply finds new ways to be remembered. When you step from the sun-baked courtyards of Mesopotamia into the long corridors of time, you find that the echoes of these sacred practices traveled farther than the scribes themselves. The Greeks, gazing eastward, heard rumors of strange Babylonian rites, and they wrote about them in tones of fascination mixed with disapproval. Herodotus, the traveler and chronicler, claimed that in Babylon every woman was once required to sit within the temple precinct and, at least once in her life, give herself to a stranger in honor of the goddess. Whether this was memory, exaggeration, or misunderstanding, you cannot fully know, but the story was told, retold, and fixed in the imagination of later ages. Rome, too, inherited whispers of these tales. To Roman ears, the idea of temple-based sexuality was both scandalous and alluring. Writers repeated the claims of Herodotus without always questioning their accuracy, folding them into broader narratives about the decadence of the East. For them, the practice was not understood as sacred union, but as uncontrolled license, proof of cultural difference, something to marvel at, but also to condemn. Thus, the ritual became distorted in the retelling, a mirror of the teller's own preoccupations more than of the Mesopotamians themselves. As centuries passed, the echoes shifted yet again. In Christian and later Islamic retellings, ancient fertility rites were painted in darker colors. What had once been considered sacred offerings became condemned as pagan lusts. The memory of women who served the goddess was flattened into caricature. They were called harlots, their sanctity stripped away, their devotion erased. Only the judgment remained. Yet beneath these layers of condemnation, you sense a stubborn persistence. The memory of temple women, however distorted, could never be entirely forgotten. You notice that fragments of their role appeared in new settings. In Greece, the hetairai, learned companions and courtesans, were not priestesses, yet they carried echoes of women who combined sexuality, refinement, and influence. In Rome, Vestal virgins guarded the sacred flame, celibate rather than sexual, but still central to the city's fate. Across cultures, the memory of female sacred service was reshaped, sometimes inverted, but never wholly erased. Even medieval travelers, wandering through ruins in Mesopotamia long after the temples had fallen silent, still repeated the old tales. They saw crumbling ziggurats, broken statues, half-buried tablets, and they whispered of ancient women who gave themselves to strangers in the name of forgotten gods. They could not see the devotion or the complexity, only the fragments of rumor passed down through generations. The sacred had become scandal in the retelling, yet the persistence of the story speaks of something deeper. It was too unusual, too charged, too bound to human memory to disappear. And so, as the echoes moved westward, they carried with them both truth and distortion. What once was a mystery enacted before the goddess became, in foreign eyes, a scandalous curiosity. Yet through misunderstanding, one thing remained clear. There had been women who stood at the center of ritual life, women whose bodies and presence were bound to the sacred in ways that could not be reduced to ordinary roles. Their legacy lingered, though wrapped in layers of rumor, judgment, and myth. You are nearing the end of this long, wandering path through temples, tablets, and whispers. You have followed the traces of women who stood at the threshold between the sacred and the ordinary, women who offered themselves not as individuals alone, but as conduits of something larger. Fertility, blessing, cosmic renewal. You have seen how they moved among incense smoke, how they touched the altars, how their presence was woven into the rhythm of festivals and the beating heart of the city. And yet, as the centuries passed, their names were unrecorded, their voices unheard. The scribes who etched kings' conquests in stone rarely paused to honor these women. The myths that sang of Inanna and Ishtar blurred the line between goddess and servant, and the flesh and blood women who lived in the shadow of those myths were left in obscurity. They existed, because the fragments remain, lines in a hymn, a scratched note in a tablet, a traveler's tale written in disbelief. But they remain in half-light, always glimpsed and never grasped in full. Still, memory persists in peculiar ways. Even in distortion, even in condemnation, the role of sacred women could not be forgotten. It was retold in the voice of Herodotus, reshaped in the accusations of priests, echoed in medieval rumors of ruined temples. It endured in whispers because it touched upon something elemental. Human awe at the mingling of body and divinity, human fascination with the boundary where ritual meets desire. What seems scandalous in one age might be sacred in another. What seems forgotten in silence may live on in the stories we tell without knowing their origin. You stand at the close of this long meditation, and you realize that to study these temple women is not simply to peer into Mesopotamia's past. It is to reflect on memory itself, how societies choose to remember and what they choose to erase. The women themselves are gone, their temples buried, their chants and gestures lost. But the questions they embody remain. What does it mean to give part of oneself to the divine? Where is the line between service and exploitation, between ritual and rumor? Why do echoes of their presence still cling to history's fabric even when the details are gone? In this way, they are not lost but transformed. They live in the stories that are told about them, in the myths that mirror their rituals, in the fascination of those who, across centuries, could not let their memory fade. You may never know their names, never see their faces, never hear their voices, but you can sense their endurance, quiet and persistent, like the faint hum of a temple song still vibrating in the silence of the night. And so the story closes, not with certainty, but with a gentle awareness. The temple prostitutes of ancient Mesopotamia remain both known and unknown, sacred and misunderstood, forgotten and remembered. Their role was once part of the rhythm of life, and though the temples are dust, the echoes of their devotion still travel, faint but steady, across the corridors of time.